I've been to rehab 4 times and I may never stay sober. I'm still recovering. It's simple, hun. You have the disease. Bill says this to me as he hands me a wooden chip inscribed with a serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. A gruff biker who somehow landed in Kelowna, Bill is paternal. I've never been told that I have a disease, but his words incite relief. I cannot stop drinking, and illness is better than badness. I have done horrible things. I accept a tattered copy of the big book and devour it, highlighting, underlining, and earmarking earnestly until I have it memorized. I meet others who do the same. We form unexpected kinships, our lives irrevocably intertwined through a singular, obstinate pursuit of wellness. I repent. They hold me. I have never felt such intimacy. When I leave 28 days later, we promise to stay in touch. I never speak to them again. I am 18 years old. I have been sober for 45 days and something is very wrong. My legs have stopped working, and when I try to articulate how physically enervated I am, how utterly incapacitated, my counselors tell me to pray. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I am drowning in a vast, violent emptiness. Anhedonia, near catatonia. The obsessions, the compulsions, the counting, the rituals, these I must relinquish to a higher power, though without them, I'm not sure who I am. Stop thinking so much. You need humility. I eat 1,175 calories a day. No more, no less. Identical meals at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. To deviate would trigger a binge. Pleasure is not safe. I attend group sessions, and while other women weep, I try to stay awake. Am I a sociopath? All I want is chocolate. I am 19 years old. I arrive with a black eye and hematoma on my chin. It obscures my jawline and deforms my cheekbones, my reflection as grotesque as the memories I suppress. I don't know how I, got there. 3rd time's the charm. I am too tired to have hope. After nearly 3 years of homelessness, I'm also too tired not to. Alcohol and bulimia have been replaced by crack cocaine. I no longer feel human. The things I did at 18 pale by way of comparison. Your brain is broken. I am hostile. My mind is a rabid animal, and I don't trust this place, these people, to tame it. 1 month becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, then 6, then 7. Something shifts. I listen in a way I never have before. I believe in a way I never have before. The obsessions, rituals, counting compulsions, they haven't left, but they have transmogrified into something like spirituality. I could drink. I stop what I am doing, fall to my knees, pray. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. 1, 2, 3 times. 6 if the thought returns. 9 times. 12, 15. I am terrified of myself. Every moment you spend in treatment, your disease is doing push-ups outside in the parking lot. It gets stronger as you do. It will never go away. In my 6th month, I enroll in 2 university courses. One of them is introductory sociology. I am intrigued. The counselors become trusted confidants. They convince me I can leave. They expect to see me regularly. I move into a basement apartment 2 blocks away. I visit the counselors every day, sometimes once, sometimes twice or more. I relay my academic successes. Don't let it go to your head. Recovery must come first. I am 22 years old. Fuck you. The voice is not my own. A new woman has just arrived and she is detoxing hard. I am 5 months sober and I have entered treatment voluntarily. I may return to my PhD, but I know I'm not prepared. I was promised that staff were trauma-informed. That was bullshit. Publicly funded, there are 2 counselors for 30 patients. Most have been street-entrenched for years or decades. We are told not to discuss drug use, or violence, or sex work, or poverty. If you get triggered, we don't have the tools to contain you. 12-step meetings are optional. AA members come bi-weekly to share their experience, strength, and hope. When they do, I look away. God, grant me the serenity. I walk past the door, my fists clenched tightly. Bile rises in my throat. I see myself in them. I will see myself in them when a month, 2 months, a year from now they use again. They will hate themselves. It will not be their fault. This place is a joke. This time the voice is mine. I am with the psychiatrist. I denigrate her profession. I do not consent to being pathologized. She raises her eyebrows, takes notes, says nothing. I leave early. In addition to bipolar disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, borderline personality disorder, possible dissociative identity disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, somatoform pain disorder, possible autism, and of course, severe alcohol and stimulant use disorders, my discharge summary notes that I present as rather angry. I am 30 years old. As I write this, I am 31 years old. I've been abstinent from alcohol and illegal drugs for nearly 2 years. Before my last relapse, I had been abstinent for 11 months. Prior to that, and prior to the 2-year bender that was my master's degree, I hadn't touched drugs or alcohol for well over 5 years. My adult life has been shaped by substance use, or lack thereof. Freneticism during periods of active use, temporal boundaries demarcated by surges of euphoria and devastating loss. Rigidity and suffocation while sober. Crystalline awareness that despite my Herculean efforts to look, think, and act normal, the best I'll do is pass. Panic, regardless. I fully expect to use again. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually, definitely. I am still recovering. Only now, I don't say that I'm recovering from addiction. Alcohol and drug use were never the problems. In a society that was built on oppression, though, that is, in a society that wouldn't exist with the ongoing displacement, dispossession, and disappearance of Indigenous peoples, that has been designed to control, regulate, and disadvantage Black communities, that approaches disability as a fatal character flaw, that produces enormous wealth disparities and prohibits anyone who can't or won't conform to white, cis-hetero patriarchal standards of productivity from access to power and resources. Alcohol and drugs are convenient red herrings. I am still recovering. Rather than focus on recovering from a hopeless state of mind and body, however, I have turned my efforts outward. For someone who once espoused the merits of sobriety and who viewed sobriety as the pinnacle of addict achievement, to now be unbothered by the idea of substance use, mine or anyone else's, is a radical departure. How did I get here? During my 3rd round of addiction treatment, I found sociology. I had very few expectations, but the systematic study of society seemed interesting, and it also fit my schedule. I still lived in extended care at Treatment Center 3, so I took the bus to campus between morning check-in, individual and group therapy sessions, and my daily chore routine. I wrote my first essays in the communal kitchen I shared with 120 other patients, and I asked staff to proofread my work because I didn't own a computer. Not that I would have been permitted to use one even if I had. At first, education was jarring. After 4 years immersed in 12-step programs, to be introduced to the social determinants of health, that is, the social, cultural, economic, and political conditions that positively or negatively influences one's health status, was destabilizing. Specifically, the insight that exclusion on the bases of income, race, gender, and disability, among other facets of one's identity, is correlated with outcomes such as substance use confounded me. I had been taught that addiction was solely my responsibility. It was the product of a malignant mind, nothing more, and so extraneous conditions such as homelessness were consequences of one's usage, not causes. The more I reflected, however, the more sociology made sense. I developed an awareness of the relationship between personal experience and the wider society, and was able to understand patterned responses among social groups as they pertain to rates of addiction. Indigenous peoples, for example, report much higher rates of alcohol and illegal drug addiction than other ethnic groups. Why? Because white frontiersmen introduced alcohol as a tool of colonization. Not only was it a profitable trade good, but authorities knew it would distract from the violence they enacted. The attempted genocide that followed included confining Indigenous peoples to reserves, apprehending and abusing generations of children through the residential school system and, in Canada, the 60s scoop, prohibiting cultural engagement, non-consensual medical experimentation, and legislation that continues to disproportionately inflate Indigenous rates of poverty, homelessness, unemployment, and murder. Furthermore, mainstream addiction treatment approaches substance use through a Western worldview, erasing traditional knowledge systems and perpetuating colonial disruption. Is it any wonder, then, that Indigenous people are more prone to substance use? This is not to say that personal stories aren't unique, or that individual trajectories won't be informed by multiple intersecting forces throughout the life course. We can't accurately predict behavioral outcomes based on 1 or 2 bits of demographic information, but we must, analyze trends within their historical contexts. Initially, I was fascinated by this information but didn't think that it applied to me. I was raised in a wealthy suburb. I'm white. I had been sexually harassed, sure, and raped multiple times while homeless. But every AA sponsor I'd had told me this was further evidence of my powerlessness over substance use. We put ourselves in vulnerable positions while using. When you stay sober, you'll stop being taken advantage of. My life chances hadn't been constrained by systemic oppression, other than ableism, but I did not yet identify as neurodivergent. Just my own bad choices. So I remained convinced that while addiction is beyond some less privileged people's control, the origins of my usage still lay firmly within me. Then I learned about trauma. My professors introduced me to the implications of interpersonal trauma, and they demonstrated that prolonged developmental trauma, regardless of perceived severity, fundamentally alters one's nervous system. I won't disclose intimate details of my childhood, but I will say that one needn't be raised in poverty or contend with racism to regularly feel afraid. This can have enormous physiological consequences in childhood, as being in fight or flight mode can lead to mood disturbances, emotional dysregulation, and loss of connection, all potential roots of addiction. Over time, it became evident that personal traumas are inextricable from broader structures such as the economic system. Our micro-level communication is shaped by the norms and expectations of societies, so values such as individualism, a product of capitalism, invariably affect our actions. AA itself is hyper-individualized. It treats addiction as a spiritual malady, and in doing so, it mars one's ability to interrogate how social inequalities make substance use desirable, and sometimes very necessary. With this, I questioned everything. What if I had been raised differently because my parents had been raised differently? If my grandparents hadn't been impoverished immigrants, would we all have been a bit more inclined toward tenderness? Would I still have developed an eating disorder? What if I developed an eating disorder, but the response to it had been less informed by a lineage of poverty? Rather than see bulimia as indulgent, would my parents have had the skills to inquire about the feelings underneath? Would I still have started drinking? What if, when I started drinking, I hadn't been sent to addiction treatment that taught me that sickness was innate? Would I have still blamed myself for all that had happened, prompting an endless cycle of institutionalization, homelessness, self-flagellation via health-negating behaviors, subsequent institutionalization, and even fiercer destruction each time it didn't have the desired result? On and on and on. But most importantly, wait, why is high-intensity alcohol and illicit drug use even considered bad in the first place? I specialized in the medicalization of deviance, or abnormality, as a mechanism of social control. In so doing, I catapulted headfirst into a voyage of unlearning everything I knew about addiction. I was enabled in part by research, yes, but mostly I grew from A, leaving AA and figuring out who the hell I was beneath the meetings and the chanting, and B, connecting with drug user activists. They, more so than any text, instilled in me that the war on drugs, not drugs themselves, is a threat to our survival. The history of alcohol and drug prohibition has been thoroughly documented elsewhere, so I needn't repeat it here. Suffice to say that substances are illegal not due to their chemical properties, but because they used to afford racialized immigrants and descendants of slavery economic and festive alternatives to wage labor. This threatened colonial nation-building projects, so state officials criminalized anything that might undermine their access to a compliant, exploitable workforce. Substance use also triggered fears of racial mixing, a major no-no among white European settlers obsessed with racial purity, and it threatened Victorian-era morality because ultimately, getting high feels really fucking good. Today, the disease model of addiction has been naturalized in common discourse. That frequent, high-intensity substance use is a chronic, relapsing condition is a taken-for-granted assumption, with few publicly questioning why so many of us get and stay afflicted. But when we closely examine the most damaging outcomes of addiction, unemployment, incarceration, lack of access to medical treatment, homelessness, fatal overdose, suicide, we see that most are derived from the stigma, discrimination, and legislation surrounding use, not the actual act of using. If, for example, heroin were to be publicly available, regulated, and normalized, people wouldn't have to use in secret. They would know exactly what and how much they were getting instead of being poisoned by a toxic drug supply, and this would substantially reduce one's risk of overdose. Beyond this, not getting fired or acquiring a criminal record by using would enhance employment options and homelessness due to unemployability would thus be less prevalent. Additionally, sustained illegal use necessarily propels one into a nefarious shadow world, one in which using becomes priority and social norms are suspended in favor of acquiring one's next fix. How much of deviance is a result of not caring to participate in society, and how much is learning to not care after being treated like a degenerate? We internalize the labels ascribed to us, and we begin to act accordingly. So where does this leave me? Ultimately, I have come to see my own alcohol and crack-fueled binges, which now happen roughly once every 12 to 18 months, as the culmination of economic, political, legislative, institutional, and interpersonal failures. When I have tried to prevent benders by seeking help for post-traumatic stress, my first option is a sterile psychiatric ward where I exist behind locked doors, am medicated beyond recognition, and am released with an appointment slip reminding me that a month later I am to meet with a harried psychiatrist who will review my medical records, tell me to consider permanent institutionalization, and prescribe me sufficient doses of antipsychotic and mood-stabilizing drugs to kill myself should I opt to, which I always seriously consider. Mid-bender, trying to seek support looks like presenting at an emergency room, waiting for hours while hallucinating or in severe withdrawal, being given hefty doses of diazepam with the instruction not to ingest it while drinking, and continuing to use. My roommates don't know how to cope. I invariably lose my housing and employment, and those I should be able to call for help have been told by well-intentioned but misguided acquaintances that offering shelter, food, and safety is enabling my addiction. For the record, it is not. I am left to fend for myself, and after 4 or so weeks of this, I am so depleted and ashamed that I crawl into detox after a bed becomes available, which can easily take weeks. Afterward, I'm still broke, alienated, and I have nowhere to go. When I went to addiction treatment for the final time, I thought that perhaps my experience would be different. I was going of my own volition, I hadn't just been scraped off the street, and I was optimistic that I might receive the trauma care I still desperately need. Instead, I watched horrifically abused women be blamed for their condition, and as I felt myself deteriorate, I got the hell out of Dodge. I am not broken. The system is. In some ways, medical sociology ruined me. I can no longer cope with the cognitive dissonance of sitting in 12-step meetings while people discuss their selfishness and self-centeredness, the true etiology of addiction, according to the Big Book, while all I see are oppression and bad policy. I've tried many times over the years, and each meeting I attend reinforces that's either not, nor have they ever been, my people. I no longer pray to accept the things I cannot change. I work, even as I oft question whether doing so is useful, to change that which I cannot accept. The former was easier, but given what I know, being passive in the face of injustice is not a viable option. I am still recovering. By working with other user activists on drug policy reform, I am recovering from loneliness and despair. By supporting a homeless encampment, I am recovering from isolation and political impotence. By writing, I am recovering from years of capitalist-induced performativity and my realities being denied. According to AA, I am delusional. I most certainly will die soon. To this I say, maybe, but at least I'll have died not hating myself. I also refuse to invite people into my life whose love for me is conditional. So when, not if, when, I use again, I will not be alone. This fills me with great comfort, and it is now more important than a sobriety date ever was. I dare call it spirituality.